Module 3, VMware Management Resources. The importance of performing configuration and troubleshooting tasks from the command line is very useful as a vSphere or VMware vSphere administrator. Your VMware vSphere CLI, or basically your command line interface, which is available with your VMware vSphere Management Assistance and provides the administrator with certain command line capabilities. By the end of this module, you should be able to meet the following objectives. You should be able to understand the purpose of your vSphere CLI commands, discuss options for running commands, deploy and configure vSphere Management Assistant, and use the VMware-CMD command for virtual machine operations. VMware recommends that you use the VMware vSphere CLI or the VMware vSphere Management Assistant to run commands against your VMware ESXi host. And you run these commands directly in the VMware vSphere ESXi shell only in troubleshooting situations. Now, there's a couple different ways here, or three different ways. You got your VMware vSphere ESXi shell, you have your vSphere CLI, and then you have your vSphere Management Assistance, which includes your vSphere CLI, or command line interface. Here we're going to discuss a little bit about the vSphere ESXi shell. And an ESXi host includes a direct console user interface, which is your DCUI, that enables you to start and stop the system and perform a limited set of maintenance and troubleshooting tasks. Now, the DCUI includes your vSphere ESXi shell, and let me tell you this also, it is disabled by default. Now, you can enable this vSphere ESXi shell in the DCUI or using the vSphere web client. Your vSphere ESXi shell, it includes all of the ESXi CLI commands, which are your ESXi command line interface commands, and it is a set of ESX config commands and a set of commands for troubleshooting and basically remediation of the ESXi host. If you have access to the direct console user interface, you can enable the vSphere ESXi shell from that DCUI. And for more on enabling your vSphere ESXi shell access, you need to see the getting started with the vSphere command line interfaces. And I kind of hit on that at the beginning, or at the beginning of each lesson. It kind of gives you links to certain VMware topics. Now, local users that are assigned to the administrator role automatically have local shell access. And assigning local shell access to the administrator role prevents the root account from being shared by multiple users. Now, with that being said, sharing the root account, it presents security issues and makes auditing the host very difficult. And one thing also I want to say here is after you enable the vSphere ESXi shell access, you can access the local shell by pressing Alt F1 to open the virtual console, and you can then return to the DCUI by pressing Alt F2. Now, your local and domain users that have been assigned that have the admin privileges on the ESXi host have root equivalent permissions in the local vSphere ESXi shell also. When accessing your vSphere ESXi shell, basically you do this, you enable SSH, and it is for a limited time. And basically that limited time period is in minutes, meaning that the default period set up for your vSphere ESXi shell is 0. And when it's set to 0 as the default, the session remains open if it's unused. Now, if you change the time out, let's say for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, you have to log in again after that timeout period has elapsed. But also understand that you need to disable your SSH or your secure access when you finish using that ESXi host or that ESXi shell. In this slide, you'll notice that you have your vSphere CLI, or your command line interface for vSphere, and it contains methods that enable you to bypass entering the username and password options and sometimes the server name option. Now you'll see here that it says the set enables you to run your common system admin commands against your ESXi host. You can run your vSphere CLI commands against your vCenter server. You can run your CLI commands normally. They require a server name, username, and a password to connect and log in to the server. And they run on top of your VMware, your SDK Perl. And also, you install the vSphere CLI package on a Linux or Microsoft Windows box, basically, or you can deploy it with your vSphere Management Assistant on your ESXi host. Your vSphere Management Assistant, which we just hit a little bit on that last slide, it enables your administrator to run scripts or agents that interact with your ESXi host and your vCenter server systems without authenticating each time you log in. Now, this management assistant, it is easy to download, install, and configure through your vSphere web client. And it also requires an ESXi host that supports a 64-bit VM. Now, the CPU on this ESXi host, it must be an AMD Opteron revision E or later, or an Intel processor with an EM64T support with VT enabled. Now, by default, let me say this, vSphere Management Assistant uses one virtual processor, and that processor has 600 megabytes of RAM and 3 gigs of virtual disk. And it is used, this assistant is only used with vSphere 5X or 6, meaning you can't use it before version 5. When you set up your vSphere Management Assistant appliance, there's basically VMware says or gives you like 4 options, and you want to deploy, configure, add your target, and authenticate it. Now, with that being said, your target servers are added so the information can be gathered from those machines, and you configure the vFastPass authentication to simplify the use of the commands on your vSphere Management Assistant. Now, when you deploy this, you deploy it from a URL or a download file. Then you configure the Management Assistant time zone in network settings, and you add your target servers to your vSphere Management Assistants, which I just hit on. They're added so the information can be gathered from each machine, and then you initialize your authentication, which is here. After you've deployed your vSphere Management Assistant, basically you power it on and you start configuring it. Now, the vSphere Management System appliance is available from the download page at the VMware website also. Now, if you'll notice here, it's got you deploying it as an OVF template, and then you just basically select your source and go from there. In this slide, we're going to configure Vima, which is basically your vSphere Management Assistant. And after you deploy it, which on the last slide I hit on, you want to deploy it and go from there. So here we're at configuring it, and we're going to select our source. Now, you must configure the appliance, and when you start the Vima virtual machine for the first time, the appliance can be configured either by opening a console to the appliance or by pointing to a web browser to the physical appliance. Now, the vAdmin or the VI admin account is the administrative account on the vSphere, the Vima or the vSphere Management Assistant appliance, and exists by default. And during the initial power on, you'll be prompted to choose a password for this user account. Now, although the vSphere or the Vima appliance is Linux based, logging in as root is always disabled on when you go to basically log in for the first time. Now that we've configured the Vima, we want to add our target. And what you want to do when you add your target is run the VIFP target --s server before you run any vSphere CLI commands or your VMware vSphere SDK for Perl scripts against that system. Now, the system remains as a Vima target across appliance reboots, but running the VIFP target again is required each time that you log into the Vima. Now, once you establish, or basically you can establish multiple servers as the target server and call it the VIP target once to initialize all the servers for the vFastPass authentication. And then you can run the commands against any target server without your additional authentication. Now, what you want to do in this instance is use the -- server based option to specify the server on which to run your commands. Now, after we basically select our target or give it the target where we want it to go to, we want to initialize your authentication. Now, this authentication interface, it enables the users and applications to authenticate with every target server that you basically pointed it to by using the vFastPass or your Active Directory. Now, while adding a server as a target, the administrator can then determine whether the target must use vFastPass or your Active Directory. Now, for your vFastPass authentication, the credentials entered by the user for the vCenter server and the ESXi host when adding either as a target are stored in the local credential store. Now, with Active Directory, the user authentication was basically authenticated through your Active Directory server. Now, when you add an ESXi host as a FastPass target server, your vFastPass creates two users, and those users are called the vAdmin and the vUser, or v-admin, v-user. Now, the v-admin has all admin privileges, and the v-user has only read-only privileges. So just remember that your vAdmin only admin privileges, and your v-user is only read-only. Now, the creation of your vAdmin and the vUser does not apply to your Active Directory targets. And with that being said, when you add a system as an Active Directory target, your vSphere, your VIMA, does not store the information about the credentials. And to use your basically to use your Active Directory authentication, the administrator must configure your vSphere Management Assistant for Active Directory. When joining your vSphere Management Assistance, or as I say, your VIMA to your Active Directory, you want to configure your VIMA for your Active Directory authentication so that your ESXi host and your vCenter server can be added to the Active Directory and to your vSphere Management Assistance, or your VIMA. Now, joining the VIMA Assistant to your Active Directory prevents you of storing passwords in the credential store. And this approach is by far a more secure way of adding targets to your vSphere Management Assistant. Now, one thing you'll want to do in this case is ensure that your DNS server is configured for your VIMA is the same as your DNS server of your domain. Now, you can change your DNS server by using the VIMA console or the web UI. You must also want to ensure that the domain is accessible from your VIMA assistant. You want to ensure that you can ping your ESXi and your vCenter server systems so that just in case you want to add your VIMA. And you'll want to ensure also that pinging resolves the IP address of your target server's domain. Once you connect your vSphere Management Assistance or your VIMA directly to your ESXi host, those commands are directly targeted at the host or sent using the vSphere SDK for Perl API. Now, those commands are also sent to the host through the vCenter server system, or first sent to the vCenter server system using your vSphere SDK Perl API. And when you use the internal vCenter server protocol, those commands are then sent from the vCenter server system basically back to the host. As you see here, we've got it going or your VIMA assistance to the ESXi host and to your vCenter server, and then this one communicates back and forth. This slide, we're going to look at your vSphere CLI command structure, and you'll notice that the target underscore option is necessary only if you're sending the command to an ESXi host through your vCenter server system. And the target underscore option, basically it specifies to which host the vCenter server system or platform service controller should be forwarded to in the command. So right here we're looking at the target option here, and then we're going to take that target option to the connection, basically to the target option of the vCenter server platform services controller, and right here then it's going to forward the command. Now in this example here, you'll notice that the VICFG NICS, which is here, it basically displays the information about the physical network interface cards on the ESXi host, which is this is your server and the VCI1. Now, for more information about this, you'll want to visit your getting started with your vSphere command line interfaces, basically at www.vmware.com support /developer/vcli, and that has some really good options and goes over your vSphere CLI command structure a little bit more in depth. You'll notice here that you have different connection options which define your parameters in the vSphere CLI commands, and those connection options are listed on the listed here are available for all your vSphere CLI commands. Now, when a session file is created with basically a session file is created when a vSphere CLI command specifies a user that is known to the VMware vCenter single sign-on, and information in that basically that session file can be used in subsequent commands as well as in scripts. Your VMA or your vSphere Management Assistant basically it includes different command sets, and your command sets basically are a vSphere CLI command set that is part of your vSphere or your VMA. So you have your ESXi CLI, you have your RSX top, you have your SV motion, your VICFG commands, your VIFS, your VMKFS tools, and your VMware-CMD command sets as well. When managing your host with the VMware Management Assistant, they're directed at a specific ESXi host, and you'll notice here that the VICFG commands can reboot and shut down your host. They can enter and exit maintenance mode. They can back up and restore your host configuration settings, and they can also add ESXi host to an Active Directory domain. And when you reboot or shut down your host, it's basically your host ops for your rebooting and shutting down, and you're entering your exit maintenance mode. And then you've got your CFG backup, which backs up and restores your configuration settings. And then you got your auth config or authentication config, which adds your ESXi host to an Active Directory domain. In the last slide, we hit on which commands do what, like shutting down and rebooting your host, or entering and exiting your maintenance mode. Now, if a host is managed by your vCenter is shut down by this command, the host is disconnected from the vCenter server, but just remember it is not removed from the inventory. Now, VMware recommends that you use your ESXi CLI or your vSphere CLI commands with the VICFG prefix, and these commands with the ESX config or CFG prefix are available mainly for compatibility reasons and may become obsolete in the future. Now, a host can be placed in maintenance mode by using the VICFG-host ops command, and when this command is run, the host does not enter maintenance mode until after the virtual machine running on the host are either shut down, migrated, or suspended. Now, this host ops command, it does not coordinate with your vSphere DRS, and an example of this is if you use that host ops command to enter maintenance mode, your DRS does not migrate the virtual machines to another host, and you must power off the virtual machine even before running that command. The VMware-CMD command is basically a command where you can manage your VMs with your vSphere web client or with your vSphere CLI command. And when you use the VMware-CMD command to perform your VM operations, you can retrieve and change your virtual machine attributes such as your power state. You can register and unregister a VM. You can manage your VM snapshots. You can connect and disconnect your virtual devices, and you can also work with the Answer VM API as well. In this slide, the connection options for the VMware-CMD, I want to make kind of a note here that your other vSphere Cloud connections options are not supported. An example is you cannot use variables because the corresponding option or that option is not really available. Now, the connection options for your VMware-CMD are different from the connection options that are used for the VICFG-commands. And in this connection option chart shown here, or basically here, your connection options, you have your -H, your -H dash VI host, your -0, your -U, -P, -config, -cred store, and or basically that deals with your credentials, and your session file, which specifies the name of the session file that was saved earlier. One thing I do want to point out here, or a couple of different ones, is the -H, it specifies your, or this one here, it specifies an ESXi host or your vCenter server, and the -O, it specifies an alternative port. Now, this default port, just so you know, is port 902. Here we're going to look at some examples of using your VMware CMD command. And one thing to note here in this slide as well is when you're registering or unregistering a VM, basically that means you're adding the VM to the vCenter server system or your ESXi inventory, or removing the virtual machine. Now, if you register a VM with a vCenter server system and then remove it from the ESXi host, what we call an orphan VM machine is the result of it. Now, you call your VMware-CMD-S unregistered with the vCenter server system as a target to resolve this issue as well, which right here we're going to unregister the VMFS volume storage 1 test VM VMX file, or we're going to register. When working with your Answer VM API, it enables users to provide input to questions, not really allowing your block VM operations to complete. Now, this option also enables you to access the input, and you may want to use this option whenever doing this when you want to configure a VM based on a user's input. An example of this or a situation would be when the user would clone a VM and provide a default virtual disk type, or when a user powers on a VM and the virtual machine prompts for the desired virtual disk type. When you're looking at your ESXi Cloud namespaces, you can manage many aspects of the ESXi host with the ESXi Cloud command set, and then you'll want to run your ESXi Cloud commands as vSphere Cloud commands, or run them in a vSphere ESXi shell, basically when you're troubleshooting. Now, this slide right here, it lists a hierarchy of namespaces and commands for each ESXi Cloud namespace, and you'll want to use or basically when you're needing help, you want to use the --help option in a namespace to list all the commands and namespaces below that particular namespace. When using your ESXi Cloud command, the ESXi host, it can be shut down and restarted with this command. It could also be used to put the system in maintenance mode. And the ESXi Cloud, so you will know, and you may kind of want to note this on the side, is the preferred method for your vSphere Cloud option when putting your ESXi host in maintenance mode as well. Right here, you'll notice your ESXi Cloud command with the VM namespace basically lists your virtual machine processes, and which is basically your ESXi VM process list. Now, one thing I will hit on is when you use this command to list all your virtual machine processes on the ESXi host, this command lists processes for all your running virtual machines on your system. Now, the world ID is basically it's similar to a process, but it's running under the VM kernel portion of it, it is used to identify a specific virtual machine in conjunction with any other commands, and it's listed in this output. And you'll see right here, basically, here's your world ID of 63194, and you'll also notice right here on here is a VMX cartel ID, and basically a cartel is a group of coexisting worlds. So you got your world ID, and then you got your cartel ID, which is your coexisting worlds, such as those that compromise or comprise a single virtual machine or a single VM. When using an ESXi CLI for your VM management, you'll want to use this ESXi CLI command to forcibly kill a VM that is basically stuck and not responding. Now, there's several methods that are available to kill a virtual machine. You have your graceful, which is a recommended method. You have your immediate, and then you have your last result. Now, the world ID for a virtual machine is used to forcibly kill the virtual machine, so just remember that. And when you use these commands in descending order, use the forced option as basically only as your last resort. When creating a standard switch with your ESX CLI, you'll want to create your standard switch, which you'll see right here. You got your ESXi CLI network vSwitch standard, add your vSwitch name, which is Vswitch5. And to add a port group, then you want to basically add a port group, or to add the port group, you want to give it your network vSwitch standard port group and add the port name testdv, which is right here your test dev, and your vSwitch name, which is vSwitch5, which goes back to here. And then you'll want to add the uplink to the standard switch, and that uplink is basically your VM NIC3 to your vSwitch name, your vSwitch5, which comes back up here to where you created your standard switch. Now, your standard switches can also be managed using your command, and they are created directly on an ESXi host, and your distributed switches are created only on your vCenter server systems. Any storage that you have can be directly connected to an ESXi host, can be managed using the ESX CLI command as well. Right here, it kind of shows to list your logical devices on the known host. You want to display a host bus device or adapter, which is your HBA. You can display your mappings between HBAs and other devices. You can rescan your devices, or basically your adapters, and you can print mappings of your data store to mount points of the UUIDs, which is your ESXi CLI storage file system list. At this point, you should be able to meet the following objectives. You should be able to understand the purpose of a vSphere CLI command. You should be able to discuss the options for running commands, deploy and configure your vSphere Management Assistant, or as I say, your VMA. Or you should be able to use the VMware-cmd command for your virtual machine operations. Now, here's a couple points that I would like to just iterate again. Your vSphere ESXi shell is useful in troubleshooting basically all your situations. The vSphere CLI is a command line interface to manage the infrastructure either by running commands or by executing scripts. Your VMA is a virtual appliance that is used to manage the infrastructure at the command prompt. Your VMA also includes your vSphere CLI, and your VMA Assistant can be used to monitor, configure, manage host, storage, and your virtual networking. If you have further questions, please contact your instructor.